the opportunity to get to know Amina over the course of an intensive year of post-2015 high-level panel meetings in London, Liberia, Indonesia, and New York. And two things stood out for me from that experience. Amina then was the special advisor to Ban Ki-moon on the Sustainable Development Goals. The first was her steely determination and skill in aligning the disparate and often competing UN bodies, funds, programs, and departments into a unified UN approach, which is really a herding cats exercise, and Amina was remarkable in it. But secondly was her passion and commitment to doing the right thing, to navigating what I think is one of the most difficult terrains of member state politics the UN has experienced, and always keeping the big picture in mind, a universal endorsement of a new ambitious and universal sustainable development agenda. And since serving as a key architect of the SDGs, Amina, as Deputy Secretary General, has become a relentless advocate for their realization. So enthusiastic that she's actually broken her foot in the process of carrying out her duties. And I would like now to all of us to warmly invite the Deputy Secretary General to deliver some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sam. It was kicking reform and it kicked back. So we're trying to. But anyway, colleagues, friends, and our distinguished panelists, most especially Kojo, Amma, Shanti, it's wonderful to see you again. Let me start by thanking Chatham House for bringing us together again, a legacy of our beloved mentor and former Secretary General Kofi Annan. Last night's public event, for me, was deeply moving and showed again the breadth of Kofi's impact across all our lives, but especially the world. Today, we continue the conversation, but with a particular focus. Let me start with a bit of the broad context, especially as we look at a critical moment in our history. By some important measures, and I think Bill Gates has said this over and over again, Mark, rising life expectancy, the declining incidence of war, the expanding ranks of our global middle class, human well-being, all continues to improve. And this is contrary to popular belief and certainly to the headlines that we see today. So it isn't all doom and gloom. However, having said that, 2019, we still face some really strong headwinds. Rising inequality, intolerance that's spreading like wildfire, and the deepening impacts of the climate crisis, which has become an existential threat to all of us. We see growing anxiety and frustration amongst young people, mental health on the rise, and among poor and marginalized communities, as well as fraying social cohesion, plunging confidence in institutions and political establishments. Globalization has yet to be perceived as fair or even advantageous. In reality, it has been exclusive for a few and often exploited on the backs of the poor. The solidarity expressed in our United Nations Charter, the opening words of "We the People," is critical for our humanity's future. The values that are enshrined throughout the document must remain at the core and continue to be our compass. And the development vision articulated in the UN has never been more important and needed in our world today. The 2030 Agenda really has come at a right time. Friends, one might say that Kofi had a plan to bring these values and visions to life. The Millennium Development Goals, the central plank of his legacy, spawned tremendous progress. It showed how goals really could galvanize people into action. The numbers of people living on less than $1.25 a day was reduced from 1.9 billion in 1990 to 836 million in 2015. This was the largest decline of its kind in human history. And quite apart from the improvements in individual lives, we were all emboldened by the clear proof that such gains are possible and solidarity for our human values very much alive. Yet much remained to be done to ensure that we have a life of dignity for everyone. With the unfinished business of the MDG era in mind, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and our 17 goals have become our new rallying point. And today we've got many, many useful lessons in hand. First, that we've seen the importance and the centrality of inclusion and strong institutions. Second, the value of national and local ownership. And third, the power of partnerships, especially with the business community. Kofi Annan was the first Secretary General who sought to harness the full capacities of the private sector to advance the work of the creation of the UN. He was convinced that governments alone cannot do everything, and I would say today they shouldn't do everything. They're not wired up to do so. And so he altered the tenor and the very basis of the UN-business relationship, where once those ties were often adversarial, Kofi sought to create space for business to do its best while benefiting society at the same time. And he did so through an emphasis not on codes of conduct, but rather a shared principle: human rights, labor rights, environmental stewardship, and anti-corruption. The creation of the Global Compact Corporate Citizenship and Sustainability Initiative has profoundly changed the dynamics between the UN and the private sector. And businesses, with their remarkable expertise, technology, and financial resources, have started to be seen and accepted as agents of change for sustainable development. And many, like Paul Pullman, championing the change of their business models to embrace sustainable development. Business themselves came to see that their enterprises could best flourish through the market-friendly success of the UN's work on peace, stability, and resilience. Responsible business providing lasting foundations for sustainable development. This may actually be a somewhat overlooked past of Annan's legacy, but he brought us to where we are today, a time when multi-stakeholder partnerships are recognized and promoted to spur implementation of the SDGs. It is a legacy of global governance anchored in both global solidarity and a shared responsibility. Friends, today we need to build on this achievement and to do so with a great urgency. Whether looking at the latest reports on biodiversity, climate change, or the SDGs, the message is unanimous. We are not moving fast enough to provide for people or to protect our home, the planet. On some goals, we're even seeing regression. Mostly, we're flatlining. Without deep transformation, we do risk catastrophic climate change, the mass extinction of ecosystems and species, even higher levels of forced displacement of our people, and a major rollback of decades of development progress, and all of the political turmoil that accompanies social and economic disruption. We need to shift the world, I believe, onto a trajectory that is compatible with the 2030 agenda. It took us 4 years to shape that. It was a collective effort. The United Nations stretched to that ambition because it reached out and brought you in. And that would lead us, I believe, to a much more fair globalization. This September, we're trying to generate a high-level political moment to do just that. Through the SDG Summit that does the first stock-taking since we signed on to the SDGs, the Climate Action Summit that does need to take action at the highest levels with the highest possible ambition, and dedicated meetings on health, finance, and small island development states. What we want our political leaders to do and our global partners is to signal that they have heard the alarm and that are intent on taking the kind of ambitious decisions and actions that will make the SDG's success a possibility once again. Whether in terms of carbon emissions, land use, renewable energy, the global food system, social protection, our institutions, the delivery of healthcare, education, investing in skills for the future, we want to see leadership and we want to see ambition urgently. Thereafter, we will be calling on our partners to get behind a global call to a decade of action over the course of 2020 to 2030. This will allow us to change course, to realign, to reposition, to get the world back on track, and to get ready for a truly groundbreaking, transformative decade of action and delivery. Not just the promises that we made in 2015, but to achieve what was intended in 1945 and what Kofi himself worked so hard to advance: peace, justice, and prosperity for all on a healthy and a thriving planet. I know that you'll all be with us, and what I hope that we will do, and I'm going to quote from the Pope again, let us turn a world of globalized indifference into one of global solidarity. Eid Mubarak, and thank you. We do have the can-do spirit.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Would you like to come up? order. So do you want to go, you're first, do you want to go there? And then do you want to go, you're last, and then Strive. Thank you very much, Amina. That was a wonderful start to our session. If I was to assemble my dream team to provide insights into the UN's development record and prospects, then it would be these three individuals on the platform. I'm going to turn to them in a moment to each speak for 5 minutes. Then I'll have a couple of follow-up questions, and then there'll be at least 30 minutes of opportunity for you to ask questions. We started 15 minutes late, so I've been told that we'll finish 15 minutes late. So we've got the same amount of time for the session. So some quick introductions first from me. Claire Melamed is the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data and served in the Secretary General's office as author of the Expert Advisory Group report on the data revolution. And she's undoubtedly the leading international policy expert in this area. So we're delighted that she's here. Secondly, Strive Masiwa is a longtime friend and a confidant of Kofi Annan, and the founder and chairman of the Pan-African EcoNet Group. He's better known to many of us here as a tireless advocate for education, health, and development across Africa. He served on a number of Secretary General commissions, including Sustainable Energy for All. And he's gone on to work on reforming the African Union and creating a Pan-African free trade area. He took over, he co-founded AGRA with Kofi Annan and then took over as chair of the board from Kofi, and has been listed for many years in Forbes magazine as one of the most influential business leaders in the world. And I think it's true. He's not just a remarkable advocate, particularly for a digital revolution across Africa, but he's also an incredibly generous philanthropist. Strive and his wife, Tsitsi, joined the Giving Pledge alongside fellow billionaires like Ted Turner, his friend Mo Ibrahim, and Bill and Melinda Gates to give away over half of their wealth to charitable causes. So we're really delighted that you're with us too. And our final panelist is Mark Suzman, who's president of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, following a distinguished career in many roles at the United Nations. We first met, I think, about 30 years ago when you were across the road. Mark has really been at the forefront of international strategic partnership across a real wide range of issues, from financial inclusion to health to agriculture. So it's a really wonderful panel that we have here. So I want to start off, Claire, with you. If you can give us some thoughts both about the progress what we made, the significance of the MDGs, and in particular data.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all. It's great to be here, and thank you to the DSG for those always inspiring words. I thought it might be helpful just to concentrate our minds on the MDGs, to think back to the era of maybe the sort of early to mid-90s, and remember what it felt like to be in a world that did not have global goals on which there was a consensus, and did not have those kind of fundamental organizing principles around which we could coalesce, around which we could make the case for funding, around which we could make the case for policy change, around which those normative conversations could take place between governments and the private sector and civil society and all of the different groups who have a role in making the world a better place. And I think it's very easy now to be complacent about having goals, and sometimes to be critical of this goal or that goal or the incentives that are provided by certain goals frameworks. But certainly from where I sit, the world that has goals on which there is global consensus is very much more likely to achieve rapid progress and partnership than a world that doesn't have those shared frameworks and consensus and that common framework for analysing whether or not we're making progress. So I think the first legacy that we could talk about today around the MDGs, and of course that being one of the key elements of the legacy of Kofi Annan during his time at the United Nations, is just that consensus and the possibility of global goal setting, and the fact that it is possible for all of these wildly disparate governments to come together and agree on a set of priorities. These are the things that we think are most important, and these are the things on which we together will commit to making progress. Of course, that has a strong normative element. This is what we want for our people in this world that we govern, and also a very strong quantitative progress. This is how we'll know whether we're getting there. And it's that quantitative element that I think has really shaped, in many ways, a lot of the ways in which different actors have thought about development and development partnerships since the MDGs were agreed. I think now we all take that for granted, but it's useful just to remember that that wasn't always so, and it's not something that we can necessarily assume will always be the case. I think a number of things follow from that quantitative framework. The first, the DSG alluded to already, the potential for partnership. Having a common framework to say, these are the things that we think are important, these are our common goals that we're striving towards, and this is how we'll know whether we're getting there, makes it very much easier for very different types of institutions and organizations to forge common action plans for getting there. This was true in the MDGs. I think this is probably more true also of the SDGs, which are the sort of, the next stage in that process. I've, for example, heard of ways in which the SDGs are operating not just as the framework for partnerships between government and business, but also that companies are using the SDGs as the framework for governing relationships within their own supply chains, and using those as the way of deciding what the sort of ethical framework is that they want to impose within their own supply chains. There's all kinds of ways in which having that normative framework is making it easier to forge those partnerships. The second element, of course, of having quantitative frameworks is the possibility of accountability. I started my career working in civil society organizations in the late 90s and early part of the century, and the value of having those quantitative indicators with which to hold governments to account was enormous. The whole movement for universal primary education was able to look at the MDGs and say to those governments, you signed up to this, now you have to deliver it. And having those quantitative frameworks and ways of knowing for sure whether things were happening or not, how far off track they were, where resources need to be allocated, changed the conversation, I think, on accountability. And that was absolutely critical. And the third thing, I think, and this comes to sort of my current role and the focus on data and innovation, is the incentives that having a quantitative framework provides for investments in knowledge and information. And the fact that certainly in the last few years we've seen this sort of outpouring of interest in the ways in which we need to invest in the knowledge and the data to know whether or not we are achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and to make the best of both some of the really exciting new innovations, satellites, mobile phones, to make sure that we have absolutely the up-to-date essential information that we now can have. We don't need to rely on information that was collected 5 years ago. We can know, if we choose to, how the SDGs were doing yesterday. But that, combined with the government's commitment to investments in some of those absolutely essential, basic, foundational systems, we're just coming up to the 2020 census round. This is going to be the census round that gives us the information to know for who we are achieving the SDGs over the next 10 years. Some of these absolutely basic, fundamental parts of the information that governments need to make decisions also has to be a part of this conversation. And I think the exciting thing about the SDGs and the sort of maturation of the way in which these quantitative frameworks are being used throughout the development ecosystem is the way it has created these really strong incentives for investment in the knowledge that we need, not just to monitor the goals, but also to achieve the goals, to know where to put resources, where should we send the doctors, where do we need to think about improving the productivity of smallholder farmers, all of these things that we need the information, and increasingly we're able to have it. So I am a huge fan of the MDGs, and even more so a huge fan of the normative, the whole approach to quantitative frameworks and goal setting. And I think for me, that is a huge part of Kofi Annan's legacy that perhaps has now become so much part of the furniture that we don't remember that we didn't used to have it. And I think it's worth sometimes pondering that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was really terrific. I'm going to come back to some of the points you raised after we finished with the initial round, but I'd like to move to Strive. Strive, you worked closely with Kofi Annan, particularly in Kenya, over many years, and was a real confidant and friend to him. It'd be great to hear something of the work that you did with him, and your reflections on what are the priorities moving forward for the UN's work in development.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. It's great to see the family again. Well, look, I think I will use something anecdotal, if I may, to sort of capture some of the work we did together, particularly as I have Mark here. So, I served on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation for 15 years. And when you join the Rockefeller Foundation, 100-year organization, you're struck by its history. And the one outsized piece of work that was done was the Asian Green Agricultural Revolution, which was led by Norman Borlaug, who got a Nobel Peace Prize for his work and was an officer of the Rockefeller Foundation. So as one of the first Africans to get on this board, I said, so why didn't we get one of these revolutions? So I kind of agitated a bit, and I had a co-conspirator in Mampela Rampela, and if you know Mampela, she's very good at that sort of thing, and we kind of pushed. And finally they said, we have no money for that kind of thing today. It was too big, it's too complex. So I said, well, I know somebody who has that kind of money, it's Bill Gates. So why can't we work with Gates? I said, well, foundations don't work together. Where have you seen foundations do that kind of thing together? So we went off to see the Gates people. And they said, absolutely, this is what we would like to do. We would love to collaborate on something of this scale. And we said, but we don't have, then they turned around and said, we don't have the political clout. Africa is 54 countries. Who can get us that engaged? We said, well, there's Kofi Annan. He's been talking about this thing, an African Green Revolution for years. And he's about to leave as UN Secretary General. So we should go and have a chat. So we went and had a chat with him, and he said, I'll do it. I'm prepared to spend a third of my time because this is really what I want to do when I leave the UN. And then he pointed to me, he says, well, you will have to be part of the thing. In fact, you can be my deputy. So I kind of, deputy to Kofi Annan, this is fun, travel in a suitcase if I could, And we did travel, and that's where I want to catch this. So after we set it up, myself, Sylvia Matthews Burwell, who became Secretary of Health, I think, under Obama, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. She was the lead on the Gates side, and Kofi, and we went to Mali, which was his choice. And you'll see why he chose Mali. He said, I want you to see everything in Mali. So we went to Mali and he said, I don't want to see the president or any of the politicians. I want us to travel up country. So we traveled by road almost as far as Timbuktu. And all along the roads were people lined up as we came along. I mean, I thought I'd seen rock stars. I mean, this was rock star stuff, 20 meters deep on either side of the road for hundreds of miles as we went through Mali. And they all came to see Kofi. And he would come out of the car, and the women would dance, and he would dance. And so soon I was dancing too. And so he would say, let's see your moves. And we would go out into the field. And we would dance, and it was always the women. The farmers were women. And he said to me, you see, Strive? The farmers in Africa are women. This is what we are going to focus our attention on. We're going to focus our attention on smallholder farmers and women. So that became the abiding theme. The smallholder farmers are women. The majority of Africa's agriculture is done by women farmers. And they are aging. He says, look, they are also aging. This is the other problem we will have to solve. And everywhere were young people milling around. And he said, that's our next problem. If we don't bring them into agriculture and solve the problem of unemployment, there's going to be a war here. And war erupted 6 months after we left. The places we went, you cannot go today. And the women in the fields said to us, Mr. Annan, we have a problem. Our crops are failing. The rains are not arriving on time. What can you do for us? We need different kinds of seeds. We've heard there are better seeds than the seeds we are using. And these were rural women. And Mr. Trump's called climate change. And they already knew. And they knew that the climate is changing. And that was what was on their minds. And so he said, so you see our challenge. We have to create jobs for young people, bring them into agriculture, focus on smallholder farmers, and they are women. And we have the challenge of climate change and possible conflict. So all these were captured in that one trip. And so for the next 10 years, that's all he ever reminded me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Mark, follow that. You've got probably the best Rolodex for international development of anyone, and have been so intricately involved in so many of these UN processes, from the MDGs through to the SDGs. So love your reflections, and particularly from your standpoint, from a foundation, from part of the third UN, on what the future should hold for us.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you to everybody in the TSG and the family. And it's a great honor to be here, and it's had me reflecting a lot on both, the wider legacy, which I'll come to, but also some of the sort of personal linkages and contingencies. And I think in a very real way, I owe my career to Kofi Annan and to Mark Malloch-Brown, in that I was a very happy, gainfully employed journalist at the Financial Times at a time when journalism was still a not disrupted industry in the late 90s. And Mark persuaded me to come to the UN Development Program to help him for what was supposed to be a one-year leave of absence from the newspaper at the beginning of 2000. And I was set to go back to journalism. And then what happened that year was the launch of the Millennium Declaration, that September, the Millennium Development Goals. And I think it is worth reflecting where Claire was of what a dismal decade the 90s had been for development generally, for Africa in particular, which got poorer over that decade on a per capita basis. And I often reflect that had I been asked to do that year in 1995, I would almost certainly have gone back to journalism and left the UN and development. But instead, that moment turned out to be an incredible pivotal moment for global development. It did change the norms, it changed the goals, it changed the sense of what was achievable. It was the UN to some degree at its very finest, because the UN can drive normative change and values. That's its core strength and its core set of competencies, in a way that at a time when the UN will always struggle a little bit when it's caught between great power imbalances or challenges in the current sort of US-China battles or whatever it might be. But in the era of development, about the value, the type of world we want to live in, that is where the UN is at its finest. And the Millennium Declaration, and for those who haven't looked at the document, I encourage people to go back to it. It's a wonderful document in itself, just in terms of an aspirational set of values, which very much was Kofi's voice and vision being driven and channeled by Edward Mortimer, who I see over there. But it is, and John Ruggie, who should be definitely mentioned. But I think that it's a truly important, as I said, it's now so much part of the furniture that there was no question when the collective movement tried to persuade Amina, somewhat against her better judgment, to come in and try and wrestle the member states to create what became the Sustainable Development Goals. There was so much energy, and the politics was so complicated because they mattered, because member states cared deeply, because they knew they would be held accountable for this. And the reason they mattered is because the MDGs and that development had fundamentally changed the way the world thought about development, multilateral finance thought about development, countries themselves reported to their own citizens about how they were doing, and that is now part of our landscape. And I think that's a hugely profound legacy that is often underappreciated from Kofi's UN. And linked to that was a much wider set of partnerships, which we've also talked about to some degree, but take a little bit for granted now, about the UN's partnership with civil society, with foundations and philanthropy, with the private sector more broadly. That while the UN is still and always will be an entity of member states, if you're going to drive outcomes and development outcomes, you do need to bring and pull together these wider coalitions of actors and partners. And Kofi did that both at the UN, and then, as Stry was talking about, very much throughout his entire second or third career afterwards at the Kofi Annan Foundation. And it's not just the Agra Alliance, although that was a particular passion of his right from the start, because he had actually commissioned a major report on agricultural development while at the UN, which no one had paid that much attention to at the time, but he remembered and cared very passionately about, and then was amazing in terms of allowing Agra to become the kind of platform it now is to drive agricultural development across Africa. But other areas like the Africa Progress Panel, many people may not remember that, but then in the immediate, after he left, that became a group of prominent African leaders, which we were proud to support from the Gates Foundation again, speaking back to Africa about political and other values. It's a role that to some degree has now been taken up by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and Mo's report. But at the time, that was quite pioneering. And so being able to drive that continued sense of accountability for a set of development issues, as well as the wider political and security and humanitarian and human rights discussions, which were covered yesterday, I think is a truly profound legacy. As I say, it's affected me personally and has driven my own career, but it has fundamentally transformed the world for the better.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Mark, I'm going to pose a question to you first, Claire. You talked about the importance of real-time data. Can you elaborate on that and what the potential is for real-time data as a transformative element? And if you could also reflect on the leave no one behind mantra. What does that mean in the data context?
Two very big questions. Let me try to be brief. I think the potential for real-time data is huge, and I think often, and it can sort of very quickly become a somewhat off-putting and technical discussion, but this stuff really does matter. We use when you see a number on a page, in 2019, this many people were, were below the international poverty line in the continent of Africa, for example. You kind of assume that that's an actual number which is based on actually somebody going out and finding out those numbers maybe that year or the year before, but it isn't. It's a sort of estimate and a model. For 2/3 of the population of Africa, the data that we're using to actually estimate those numbers for poverty are based on data. The actual data itself was collected before the SDGs were even agreed. This is how far our data lags behind our lives. And when you think about how fast the world is changing, the changing patterns of employment, of migration, all the things that we know are changing so rapidly across the whole world, the fact that we don't have accurate data and up-to-date data with which to guide policy, with which to guide advocacy, with which to guide resourcing decisions of foundations, of governments, of the UN itself and others, it's a serious problem, and it's a problem that now, perhaps for the first time in history, is completely fixable. It's just a question of choosing to do it. We have satellites, we have mobile phones, we have all of the things which give us new sources of data and make the traditional sources of data cheaper and faster to collect. It's easier now to do a survey. It's easier and faster to do a census and get the information quickly to where it needs to be. So this is a matter of political choice. How much do we value data and information, and how much collectively do we want to invest in that data which underpins, which is, as Mark said, the thing which makes the difference between the MDGs, the SDGs, and other kinds of international agreements that don't rely on those quantitative goals. So I think, there is a huge and exciting potential here for really doing data, doing data in a very different way, and thinking about solving some of those problems which have been around for so long we've almost forgotten that we can fix them, but now we can. And that's very exciting. For my organization, we're just about to launch a new initiative together with the World Bank, the UN's Statistics Division, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network to really pull together those countries that want to be in the lead on this, the UN agencies, foundations, civil society organizations, and others to really focus attention on this, pull together all of the amazing stuff that's already happening and get it pointing squarely at the SDGs to solve this problem. So the first gap that we worry about around data is that gap of timeliness and just being so far behind reality. The picture that we have with which to make decisions lags so far behind the reality of people's lives. And in a fast-moving world, this is a problem. And the second thing, as you said, is the Leave No One Behind agenda, and the fact that, for many people, they never even get into the data in the first place, whether that's the data that was collected yesterday or the data that was collected 5 years ago. People who live far out, beyond the reach of those people, of the enumerators or the census takers who collect the data, people whose activity, who are migrating, people whose jobs are sort of hidden far below the surface of the economic statistics that governments collect and the data that we have on how money moves around an economy. And these are exactly the people on whom the SDGs agenda is most squarely focused. And the commitment to leave no one behind is the kind of normative imperative that underlies the whole of the SDGs agenda and is the thing which people come back to again and again as the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's kind of hard to imagine how we can leave no one behind if we didn't even know where they were in the first place. And I think that really, again, is the second big job that we have to do on the data front, is to make sure that everyone is in the data in the first place. If you think about how important data is for resource allocation, for decisions, for accountability, it's a kind of real injustice that we probably don't talk about enough, the fact that so many people's lives are just completely hidden from view. And it's very hard to know how a government can, a government's not going to build a hospital or a school or a road for people that it doesn't even know exist. And I think that this kind of injustice of invisibility is the second place that certainly on the data front, I would love to see the SDGs really starting to kind of galvanize attention and resources, new partnerships, new innovations, as well as investment in some of that basic foundational stuff.
Thank you very much, Claire. Strive, I'd like to pose to you Amina's challenge last night, which was, how do we mobilize, inspire the young people of the world? And if anybody knows the secret to that, I think it must be you. Not only have you run an international technology company, you have millions of Facebook followers, but also your family foundation has helped, I think, 250,000 orphaned and disadvantaged children very directly. So what insights have you got into how we inspire the next generation of young people and leaders?
Well, this is the great challenge. If you look at our continent in numbers, the mean age of the African population is 19. Half of our people are under the age of 20, half the population. It's the fastest growing component of the world's youth. So for us, if we don't rise up to the challenge of the youth and convert that into a dividend, the other side of that equation will be pretty terrifying for the rest of the world. And this was something Kofi Annan was always on about. We've got to inspire the young people to come into agriculture. Africa's youth turned away from agriculture, and for good reason. We didn't offer any real opportunity through agriculture. We've got to deal with the education of the girl child in Africa. This was a major conversation we had, because I was also a member of the Africa Progress panel with him. And so the first thing you got to do if you're going to inspire the young people, you've got to listen to them. That's really, it's not a magic thing. You've got to listen to what they have to say, what their concerns are, with respect, and be prepared to engage them in their own future and allow them to explore how to run things and to have the confidence that they can do a better job than us. So I try very much to do my little bit in that respect.
Thank you very much. Mark, the nature of development is changing before our eyes. Foreign direct investment remittances already dwarf overseas development assistance, and partnerships are seen to be the future. Yet member states are often reluctant to share power and share decision making with other actors. What do you feel is the one or the first or second absolute priority that we should all take away in terms of helping Amina realize the SDGs?
Well, she did create 167 targets, so you've got 169. Sorry, I missed 2. I won't say which 2 I missed. But I think the main about that is our focus, and certainly the one I think at an event like this we should be most occupied with, and was firmly written in the documents that Amina helped lead, but often does get forgotten, is that leave no one behind agenda. That there is an unfinished agenda of the MDGs along with the more ambitious, broader agenda of the SDGs. And for all the progress in the statistics that Amina cited, and they are very real, and there is a very robust statistical analysis done by Annie showing that the MDGs really did bend the curve of progress in areas like child mortality, maternal mortality, reduction of HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, and so on. But there are still hundreds of millions of people, suffering, and that agenda really has moved on with all the discussion in aid agencies, even in the domestic debates of, we've had very big elections in Nigeria, in India, in Indonesia, in South Africa, just in the last few months. And if you go through the election debates, often these are debates around the middle class issues. They're around energy, they're around infrastructure. They're important, really critically important issues, but you don't get a big discussion around, for example, domestic investment in health in India. India is a country which invests a relatively small proportion of its GDP in health. And so I think if there's one area for us, it's how you use and frame what actually the World Bank is now, I think the UN would argue, learning late and borrowing from the Human Development Index with a now big focus on human capital, that fundamentally investing in people, in health and education, is the core starting point for sustainable long-term development. It is the core essential to provide the tools and opportunities for those young Africans Strive was describing. And while there's a lot of talk around that, if you actually follow where the money and resources are going, they tend still not to be going to that. People have moved on a little, so we would encourage a focus back on those core issues.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to now open it up to the floor. Please signal wherever. There's a lot of hands. Thank you. Gentleman in the middle there, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. This is a question for Strive. I work with mindsets. I work one-to-one with people. And one of the things that strikes me that if Africa's problems that you described for the young is going to be solved sustainably, it's got to come from the young people. What mindset change do you believe is required, both among the young, but also everyone else who's around to support them? What, if you were going to say, what single mindset change is required?
Strive,
Do you want me to answer straight away?
Yeah, do you want
Sure.
to?
I focus on entrepreneurship and the power of entrepreneurship, giving the young people the skills to start their own businesses. Because it's one thing for us to have industries that cannot create jobs. If you look at what we normally have focused on as African industry, it doesn't create jobs. Our mines aren't creating jobs, all these industries we have. But when you focus on African entrepreneurship, and it's very much alive. So and they are ready. Africa's teeming with young entrepreneurs. What they need is support by way of skills and effective policy making. So for the older Africans, get the policies right and get out of the way so that they can get on with the job of building businesses. Those would be our mindset. But we've also got to focus on our education system. Our education system is not fit for purpose. It's somewhere we left it just before 1960, I think. So we need to get an education system that is particularly drives vocational training, skill them up so that they can go out and build their enterprises.
Thank you very much. The woman on the far side of the room there, thank you.
Thank you. Gleda Land from the Energy, Environment and Resources Department here at Chatham House. I wanted to ask a question, but first I also wanted to draw on what you were saying, Claire, about the measuring, monitoring data on the most vulnerable, the ones most likely to be left behind, because we at Chatham House began an initiative in 2015 to include displaced people and refugees, particularly in measuring progress on SDG 7. Energy access to reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. And that's been hugely successful, and we really felt the boost from having Kofi Annan offer his support and write the foreword to the report that we first wrote, Heat, Light and Power, Saving Lives, Reducing Costs for Refugees in 2015. So yes, we remember that very fondly. So I wanted to ask a question about the impacts really of the energy transition globally, and those countries in Africa which are highly dependent on oil and gas and maybe other extractives for their income and for their sources of energy, and what that really means for agriculture, and maybe how donor countries, green finance, institutes like the African Development Bank can assist countries with making the transition, with creating diversification and jobs. Thanks.
Thank you. That's probably also one for you, Strive. So I'm going to take another couple and then come back to the panel members. Remember to give your name and your affiliation, and please stick to short, sharp questions. Thank you. Yes, James.
James Kearney, Chatham House. This is a question primarily for Claire Melamed. Does your network and your data champions have a role to play in conflict prevention? Because conflict, let's face it, can wipe out all of the good work done in development with almost overnight, and Syria is an unfortunate example of that. If we look at the Rwanda genocide case, for example, of course there are the ethnic tensions and the various imperialistic backdrop, but what we sometimes forget is the drop in coffee prices in the 1990s and so on. So I'm just wondering, is there a role for the data and the mechanisms you're developing in terms of actually anticipating and thus preventing conflict?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Roman. I manage Polish university based here in London. Actually, we had not as much luck as our colleagues from AGRA with speaking to Gates Foundation. Probably we spoke to the wrong people who don't understand labor market in Africa. Anyway, we had a lot of luck with speaking to European Union, and we carried last year very advanced research about unemployment and poverty in Africa. So we are bringing big data and artificial intelligence to Africa now to secure about, we think that it can be 150 million very basic job places. And question to Claire, actually, because you are saying that you are gathering real data, but it is probably only macroeconomic data. How about microeconomic? As our colleague from AGRA is saying, entrepreneurship in Africa is very vivid. Yes, it's very young and very vivid.
Thank you very much. Strive, would you like to tackle the first question?
Sure. You know, 25 years ago, when I entered the mobile phone industry, 75% of the African people had never heard a telephone ringing. Today, 75% of the African people have a mobile phone. And in some African countries like Botswana, there's somehow managed to have two. So where are we on the energy side? We're where we were 25 years ago. I believe that the technology on the renewable side has reached a point where we can deliver very quickly on energy. What we need is to bring in the entrepreneurs and the capital. We need to get the policy framework that got people like me to go into Nigeria and pour billions to drive Nigerian mobile development. At the moment, the conversation does not yet involve entrepreneurs and capital. I participated in some of the reports, and I know all the data and the statistics about where we are, but I seriously believe that 25 years from now, we can deal with the energy deficit in Africa if we now turn our attention to getting the entrepreneurs moving and allow capital to come in.
That's great. And I'll just do a plug there for one of the DFID sponsored initiatives, Energize Africa, which funds both businesses and small businesses and families, providing solar panels at a small scale that can be used to charge mobile phones, to put a light on so children can do their homework and so on. So if you go to the fx.org website, you can look at things where you can invest in a range of countries from the DRC to Kenya. And there's a number of other sort of opportunities, but there's things that we can do practically as individuals to really transform people's lives.
Just to give you an example on, we have, in our group, we have a business we started about a year ago, and we are rolling out mini grids, small solar power systems, 6-kilometer radius. We're connecting people to have as much power as they want, not little lights blinking in the room. We believe that the technology is coming right. And you are going to see some extraordinary things happen in this space.
Great, thanks. Claire, there were two questions posed to you.
Thank you. So data and conflict prevention. I mean, I think, first of all, I'd like to have a sort of a word of caution that, you know, obviously when you work on something all the time, you think that that's the most important thing. I would never say that data is the most important thing in terms of preventing conflicts. I think there are many other more important ways in which people act around the world and in different contexts to prevent conflicts. But I do think that, as you suggested, there are ways in which having different kinds of data can help with some of the sort of signalling around when action, different kinds of action needs to be taken. And I'm reminded particularly of some work that was done soon after the Arab Spring, and particularly in Egypt, where people were saying, but look, all the economic indicators were going in the right direction. There was growth. You know, why on earth did everybody suddenly start to, you know, protest in the streets? And Gallup, the polling agency Gallup at that point said, no, we saw it, because we were collecting different kinds of data. We were collecting data on how people were feeling about their governments, how people were feeling about their rights and their access to you know, their ability to affect change in their own lives and so on. So I think there are ways in which, particularly kind of combining different kinds of data and being open to data, as long as it sort of fulfills certain, you know, requirements around quality and, you know, and sort of robustness and so on, can help to combine different kinds of information. And perhaps being open to data from different sources can give us that broader picture of the world that means that data is being more effective as a signal. And we are, you know, we're looking in different places. And I think there are ways in which, certainly in that context, and perhaps in others too, having data, particularly on sort of how people are feeling. Data often, we often sort of see data as a way of telling people about their lives. This is where your economy is. This is what's happening in your job. But actually data is a really important way of people telling policymakers about their lives, what they think, what they want, and aggregating that. And it's a really important kind of method of political communication, I think, between people and governments. So I think that is certainly one element of the way in which data perhaps could give us a wider set of signals that would help to alert to the potential presence or sort of likelihood of conflict and so on. And the second point on macro data, I mean, I think, you know, macro data is hugely important, and in many cases, you know, not good enough. But I think, again, you know, I suspect this is going to be my answer to every question that I'm asked this morning, is about sort of combining different kinds of data. So of course we need those macro data. We need to know about trade. We need to know about inflation. We need to know about the overall health of the economy. But again, we have possibilities now to look in a much more granular way at what's happening in the economy. With mobile money transfers, we can look at what's happening, you know, not just the sort of bigger picture of prices and wages, but we can actually look at how people are, you know, what is happening to flows of money around a country, who is spending what where, and how those things are changed, how those things change in response to new investment opportunities, the growth of different industries, patterns of migration, and so on. So we have, again, this opportunity now for combining different kinds of data and giving us this much more granular picture, which of course is a huge boon to researchers, but even more so to policymakers and people who are actually trying to influence the course of those events.
Thank you, Claire. Mark, do you have any reflections, or should we?
Just on the data point that says, I mean, I think Claire's fundamental underlying point that we are at a transitional moment where we can generate and use much more real-time data to drive policymaking even in very poor countries is there. It's like Strive's point about where we are in the potential energy revolution. The areas that we work, like, you know, polio eradication or provision of family planning, whatever, we are able to use now combinations of satellite data, cell phone, to get you much more rapid real-time information, which allows for much more defined sort of resource allocation, more specific targeted policies. And so I think that is a real opportunity right now for the SDGs.
Thank you very much. I'll take another round. Wow, lots of us. So I'm going to take Robin in the front row, please.
Thanks very much. Strive, I was struck by your comment, A, about needing to listen to young people, if you're going to inspire them, and then the need to inspire them to focus on agriculture and smallholding in particular. I do not claim to be somebody who knows Africa at all well, but urbanization seems to be one of the big drivers. I'm trying to, how do you connect, and maybe this is to Mark as well, this desire to really encourage sustainable return to effective farming and agriculture with this huge drive at the moment for urbanization? Is the urbanization part of the answer in getting that done sustainably? I'm just struck by your emphasis on the smallholder and agriculture.
Great, thank you. Good question. The man just there, yeah, thank you. You. Yeah.
My name is Doji, Ghana High Commission, UK. My question is to Strive. Strive, what are you doing to ensure that these smallholder women farmers have access to funding? I do know that in some of the countries where cheaper sources of capital like development finance and grants from Gates Foundation are available, some of these women farmers do not even know that those sources of capital exist. What are we doing to ensure that those women in Mali, in Timbuktu, know about the sources of funding available to them?
Thank you very much. And the women just in the middle block there, trying to prioritize people who haven't spoken before in the conference.
Anita Bonwani, I'm a risk advisor and also a member of the group that's developing the ISO standard on governance, which is focusing on the SDGs. We see the best of humanity in the face of natural disasters and the international community coming together. How can we get that same spirit, cooperation, commitment to more slow-burning crises like climate change?
Great. I'll take one more. Yes, the gentleman. Two back. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles Steele, member of Chatham House, currently also chair of Save the Children in the UK. We've heard a lot this morning about the importance of goals and data and the amazing example of AGRA. My question is about measuring impact. Would love to hear from the panel in terms of their experience, organizations, social enterprises, NGOs, agencies, anyone who you've seen who not only sets targets, but collects the data and manages performance and assesses impact really well. People that we can look at and study and learn from. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So, Strive, let me start with you. If you could answer Robin's question about urbanization, and then I'm also going to ask you, Mark, to reply to that. So, Strive, Robin's question and also the question from the Ghanaian High Commission. Over to you.
And I'll ask Mark to join me in on this because we are AGRA together. He's played an incredible role in getting AGRA to be where it is. And let me blend your questions in several respects. So if I have a Facebook platform, as you know, where I talk to young entrepreneurs. And what I do is I post I say something, and then I listen to them. They comment. I read the comments. I get something like 20,000 comments a week. And I pick their comments and I answer. I say, John, you said this. This is what I think. And that's what's built the platform into a high engagement platform. But what I've had conversations with them about is, how do we make agriculture more interesting for you? Well, they said, we've got to make money from it. I said, okay, let's not talk agriculture, let's talk about food. Food, how about feeding Africa's 4 billion population by the end of this century? Does that excite you enough? Well, it excites me as an entrepreneur. So let's look at it more broadly. It's not just about producing food, it's about the whole food industry. Let's talk about Nestle and Unilever, and look how big they are. Well, we need a few African Unilevers and Nestles. Let's get going, guys. Okay, and we put prizes out, and suddenly what you are seeing is the activity that's going on behind that none of you are seeing. About young people developing apps to use tractors, to mobilize markets, mobilize access to finance. And so So a lot of this is already going on, and they are thinking about it, but we just ignored them. So yes, we're not going to stop urbanization. It's part of the development matrix. But we've got to reimagine the way our rural areas operate. Okay? At the moment, they're a place to get away from for young people. They're not a place for opportunity. They're not a place for a better way of life. So we have to get them interested in reimagining how that is going to operate and how we are going to interact with our urban populations. So I think it's showing and discussing the opportunities. In answer to your question, Ghana is a very good example, because we set up an office. We have 2 offices of AGRA, one in Nairobi and one in Ghana. Not that our chairman came from Ghana, it was just nice place, Ghana, right? So as AGRA, our job is not to provide financing. You cannot develop African agriculture with donor financing. It has to come from within the countries themselves. So the whole approach that we took was to engage the Ghanaian government about agriculture and those countries which are interested passionately in agriculture. So we focused on them. We developed plans together. We looked at where the shortfalls are. A good example is we said to your central bank, if your banks aren't lending, let's have a study why. Why don't the Ghanaian banks, Nigeria's banks, 1% of their lending is to agriculture. Yet that's where the people are working. How do we open this up? So we developed new tools around agricultural security to the banks, to encourage them to provide lending to the farms. So we have a program in Ghana which is pushing banks in Ghana to increase their exposure to smallholder farmers backed by guarantees. So it's a long way, but these are the kind of solutions that we need to engage on.
Mark?
Maybe just a slight add to Strive's. Obviously, our aspiration and AGRA's aspiration for success in Africa is not simply to create a lot of robust smallholders who just support themselves. The reality is its focus is on very poor people. The majority of the very poor in Africa are still the rural poor. They do act as subsistence farmers. But what we want to do is actually combine and create proper agricultural entrepreneurs who become self-sustaining, who do expand. That is the economic growth model, and that actually will encourage both productive urbanization and more productive employment by younger people back in rural areas that generates wider economic growth and becomes a virtuous cycle. This is not something to be invented in Africa. This is a standard development model that we've seen work in all parts of the world. It's working right now in many African countries, or starting to, and so the success is both and. Then just maybe to build on the question about impact and results of data. AGRA is a good example of an organization which now sort of checks it provides sort of extra information and tools around agriculture, the most advanced agricultural training, sort of seed development and purchasing. It may not lend itself, but it does provide information and data about how best to access private capital and so on. And then it has a set of metrics there. Another example of a successful one, which actually perhaps should have already been highlighted more in this session, is the Global Fund to Fight HIV, TB, and Malaria, which Kofi was the founding patron of. And that's a multi-billion-dollar effort, which really has massively driven down costs and access to antiretroviral drugs for HIV, to bed nets, to reduce malaria, to tuberculosis treatment. It's the largest source of funding for all 3 of those diseases. It saved literally millions of lives. There's 17 million people on antiretrovirals today. That malaria deaths have halved over the period from 2001 to 2018. And so those are very clear metrics. You measure each bed net, you measure each antiretroviral, you show the cost, you see where they're going, you partner with the governments around the health systems and structures to do that. But that's also an example of where there's about to be a replenishment for the Global Fund hosted by President Macron in France later this year. And currently, the trends do not look good that we will meet there, even though this is a completely proven set of interventions that is very high impact, very effective. In the current global climate, it's going to be a real struggle to actually meet that financing challenge.
Great. Claire.
Thank you. First of all, the colleague from the Ghana High Commission just want to sort of recognise the leadership of the government of Ghana on the data agenda. The government of Ghana we work closely with a number of partner governments and their statistical officers, and the government of Ghana is one of our closest and most effective partners. I've just come back from a trip with taking 9 international journalists to see some of the work that the government is investing in relation to data and the use of data in policy making. And one of the most effective partnerships that we've been able to broker to date is between our partner governments in Africa, NASA, Space Agency, Amazon Web Services, a number of academic institutions to make satellite data readily available for policy making. And we were seeing some of the ways in which the government of Ghana is really putting this into practice to fight illegal mining, to look at protection of the coastline and water resources and so on. And it's really inspiring to see both the kind of strength of the technical commitment, but also the strength of the political commitment, really, that runs right to the top of government to use data. And the Vice President gave a speech at the opening dinner, and he said something which really struck with me, which is that governments have to be prepared to hear the good and bad news in the data. And it's when a government is investing in what the stuff it doesn't want to hear that you know that they're really serious about using data for policy making. So I just wanted to recognise and congratulate you on that. On the question particularly about measuring impact, I think Mark's spoken really, obviously about the sort of specifics of measuring impact in different contexts and the huge sort of work and progress that's been done on that. I would suggest that there are sort of 3 principles to think about in terms of effective sort of ways of approaching the measurement of impact. The first, of course, is the robustness of the data and making sure that the tools, as Mark said, that the tools that are being used to actually monitor impact are up to the job, that what the data that you're collecting is robust and says what you think it says, and will give you, again, both the good and the bad news about impact. The second, I think, which links back perhaps to an earlier question, is about impact. What kind of impact are you measuring? I think it's really important and often underinvested in to understand the impact from the perspective of the people who are supposed to be benefiting from the program. We don't just want to know about the sort of details, of what we think is important. We also want to understand how people themselves are understanding the impact and prioritize, how they understand the changes that are happening in their own lives, what they prioritize, how they experience things. So I think the impact, according to who, is always a really important question to ask, and getting a wide variety of views on that. And the third thing is about the impact of monitoring programs on the wider data systems in the country. Donors, foundations, non-governmental organizations spend a huge amount of money on monitoring impact across the world. But I think all too often that money isn't spent with regard to how it could also benefit the development of data systems within particular contexts for the wider benefit of policy making, of accountability, of the kind of development of systems of government worldwide. So I think there's a way in which thinking about monitoring impact, not just as a sort of standalone part of the program, but also actually as part of a sort of systemic approach to relationships with government and government systems in particular. So those would be my sort of 3 suggested questions to ask in thinking about about the sort of systems for monitoring impact and the relationship to wider investments in data.
Thank you very much, Claire. Now, I think, Anita, your question was only sort of partially answered, but I hope you'll. What I want, allow me to continue. What I'd like to do is, if there's any young people that would like to ask a question, and
young, Sam.
up to your discretion, young at heart, and any other women. I've picked all the women who put their hands up so far, but I want to have balance in this session. So, any other? Yeah, fantastic. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. You first, please.
Yeah, I cross off two of your criterias. I just wanted to ask a question about data-driven. The term data-driven gets thrown around all the time, but I wanted to ask what the importance of being data-informed. I think it's well and true and really well to focus on collecting as much data as possible from everywhere and anything, but we've had data on air pollution from the steel industry since the 1950s, and it's now, in 2019, that air pollution campaigns are really starting to ramp up. That data's been sitting there. So I wanted to ask, how important is it for policymakers, NGOs, and industry in general to be data informed as well, to take the data and use it?
Wonderful, thank you. And the woman just there. Thank you. I'm going to collect. Can you keep your questions really short now? I want to collect as many questions as we can because this is the last round, so please.
Hi, I'm Izzy Kuma. I just wanted to ask, how can we meaningfully equip young people with the skills to actually participate, not just be someone who is listened to, but to actually properly contribute? I mean, some of the things that have been said today are absolutely amazing. I can't remember pre-94. So what you're saying about development in the 90s is really important, but that needs to be shared amongst young people. And do even conferences like this have a duty to have more young people in the audience?
Thank you very much. Yeah. And the woman in the front row there, please. Thank you.
Hi, Trisha de Borgrav, a writer, but also work closely with something called Global Women Leaders, a strategic philanthropy. And what we find a lot of is that frustration of not being able to track where the money is going. And therefore, we have to engage with people who very much work at a local level. Is your sort of real-time data really focusing on where every $10 goes?
Great, thank you. We've got the young man there, just behind the DSG.
Hello, Darwish Nuruddin, environmental engineer. I just wanted to ask about the digital economy. And while it presents a lot of opportunities, it does pose a lot of problems. So one of the problems such as updating laws for governments for digitalization of businesses, the automation of jobs that are exposing a lot of risks on traditional skills, and the frightening pace that artificial intelligence is growing at the moment. So my question is, how urgent is the agenda treating this matter? And what do you think the sort of frameworks that are needed to tackle these risks? Thank you.
Wonderful. I do two more very, very quick ones. Anybody else? Please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Shao from China. I wish to know how can the UN do more together with the other organizations to promote food security in the world?
Thank you. And I think the last question is there, Richard Gowan.
I'm Richard Gowan from Crisis Group. Very quick question for Mark. You drew a distinction between great power competition and cooperation over development. Do you think that distinction will hold? We see the US increasingly framing its development policy in terms of national interest and competition with China. The US hasn't renounced the SDGs yet, but there is a risk that it might do so later this year. That wouldn't matter that much necessarily, but is there a risk that international competition will start poisoning the world of development again?
Wonderful. I'm going to turn back to the panel now. So in order, starting with Mark, please.
Okay. It's ending with a really tough question there, but it's a great one. So we are, we talked a lot about Kofi being a stubborn optimist. At the Gates Foundation, we like to call ourselves impatient optimists. Mm-hmm. And I think there are a number of areas still on, genuine collaboration and on pure public goods. One area, for example, is public health. A lesser known thing amidst all the challenges you have on the current sort of China-US order breakdowns. One of the areas that we are working on, there is a development which the African Union has endorsed to create a new Centers for Disease Control in Africa, which comes out of the Ebola crisis in West Africa a couple of years ago. That is being driven and led out of the African Union. The three entities providing direct support to it are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the US CDC, and the Chinese CDC. Because that is a clear global public good in terms of disease surveillance within Africa for African citizens, but also for the world. We think if you can find areas like that, in agricultural development, to the wider question about Nigeria, this is a discussion where, again, we have direct partnerships with the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture, and we've been looking at areas of where China can actually, I think we just had an agri-delegation in China last month to talk about how we can develop and learn from some of the Chinese experience of agricultural productivity revolution, put that into a multilateral framework. And that's, again, very much in partnership with some of the work that USAID and others do. So while at the big, great power thing, absolutely, you have the trade wars and the tensions. I think there are very concrete areas, but you've got to drive them into specific issues. Malaria would be another one where, again, we have, just sticking with the China example, China is on the verge of eradicating malaria. It's the place where artemisinin, which is malaria treatment, comes out of. There's a real opportunity for China to be a leader in global malaria. But the Global Fund to Fight HIV, TB, and Malaria is primarily funded by the US and the UK and the Gates Foundation and France and other countries. And so, yes, we remain optimistic that there are platforms, even though we want to be realistic when the stakes get very high, that recedes. Just a couple of general points to close on sort of trying to weave together some of the data, because including on the AI and digital technology. First, I'll just do a advertisement next week. Please tune in on Monday. The Secretary General will be hosting Jack Ma and Melinda Gates in New York, who will be launching the outcomes of the UN High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, which tackles all of those questions. You may not be satisfied with the answers, but it does try to look pretty comprehensively at some of the pros and cons, what regulatory and global efforts can and should be made, but also to try to see some of the very real opportunities. And another area that Strive is actually co-chairing with Melinda Gates and Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Indonesian finance minister, is a thing called Pathways to Prosperity, which is really looking at how you can have digital and other tools, especially in the developing world, provide new kinds of opportunities. Trying to have a slightly different narrative to the robots are going to take our jobs, and actually looking through the longer term opportunities. And then last but not least, with that data, we are an excessively, some of our grantees would say, data-driven organization, the Gates Foundation. Part of that, right, so I have two bosses, Bill and Melinda Gates, who are unusually disposed to be persuaded by data and are baffled. And a lot of the reason my job exists is because they couldn't figure out why the world didn't understand this data, to your point about being data-informed. Well, surely if we show that this intervention works, policymakers will take it up. And you realize that is fundamentally not the case, as is very clear in all sorts of examples today. And so a very resounding yes to the data-informed and then the data-driven. You've got to combine them, and how you actually drive attention to that. Back to the question about climate and it's very challenging. You've got to put that into, you've got to combine data with stories. You've got to make it accessible and human. We know the hard way that simply drowning people in data, this audience may also be unusually receptive, but it doesn't actually work in terms of long-term outcomes.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to go to Claire and then finally to Strive.
Thank you. Yes, 100% agree with what Mark just said about the sort of use of data and the importance of stories as well, and the kind of political narrative. But I really wanted to focus also on this point about data-driven. I think, yes, I agree. I sometimes feel uncomfortable with the sort of term data-driven decision-making, as if data was all that you needed to make a decision, because of course we all know it's more complicated. Now, I think there are kind of 3 points to make, or sort of 3 points to make here. The first is that where a government does want, or whatever body, a government, a donor, a civil society organization already does want to do the right thing, has already been persuaded by the stories or the data, then you need the data to show them the road, the pathway, what to do, where to allocate the resources. So I think data has that incredibly important, data is part of what you need. Once you already know you want to do something good, then data helps you to do it effectively, efficiently, in the best way possible. The second thing, I think, is that the value of data as an advocacy tool. Data, admittedly, your point about air pollution doesn't always work, but there are some sort of hugely effective uses of data by advocacy organisations that have changed the political weather. around making the case when combined with the stories and the opportune political moment and the effective strategy, data is part of the toolkit of changing minds and changing policies. So I think that's a second way in which we want data to influence decisions. So, you know, data can help persuade people where to go, and then it can give them the tools to get there. But I also think it is really important to neither desire nor expect a political system which is driven entirely by data. I don't want, you know, there are some decisions which are political, which are distributional. Data can't tell you what is the best tax system to have, because that is a normative question about whether you want your tax system to be redistributive. Who do you want your policies to benefit? When you know what kind of tax system you have, then the data can help you to decide how to do that effectively. But there are some questions which shouldn't be data-driven, which are actually about the kind of world we want, about ethics, about morals, and about norms. And I think, you know, data is the toolkit, but it's not the kind of guiding star.
Thank you. Strive, your final reflections.
Thank you. You know, going back to my earliest remarks about some lessons from my elder brother, he said to Mo Ibrahim and I once, he says, you know, if we left the issue of food security to you guys, you big guys, of course we'll get the food, but that's not the way we're going to do it. We have to have inclusion. We have to address it from the reality of what's on the ground. African smallholder farmers with 2.5 acres, no access to capital, no access to title deeds, women don't own the land. That's what I want you to solve. I don't want huge commercial farms. Yes, you can do it that way, but these are the challenges you are going to have to address. So we have to address it with that complex matrix. Climate change, women without access to land, women without title deeds, access to capital, very small farms, addressing productivity. But what we're going to miss from Kofi is that breadth that he had, bandwidth to understand the broader issues, such as conflict. That if we don't address food security, we have no global conflict. To him, Boko Haram, all those things, all were linked. It was linked to climate change. It was linked to our inability to provide skills to young people. It was linked to our inability to provide inclusive societies, which drove people to the extreme margins. We're going to miss that because he was always the peacekeeper. That's where he always started. And food security is at the nexus to peace. So in Agra, yes, we started with Rockefeller Foundation and Gates Foundation as anchor foundations. But Kofi was clear. It had to be African solutions. It had to be an African institution. It had to reach out to the global community. Today, it is not funded by Rockefeller and Gates Foundation. They are key partners, but we have differed. We have the Chinese. That's why we came to see. We're Brazilians. But most important of all, we have the Africans themselves. We have the African governments. We talk to the African governments about how do you increase your spending on agriculture? How do you ensure that your own population are receiving the access that they need? And that is his legacy for me, that you can sometimes find a solution, but it's not the right solution. We have to have inclusion, and our security depends on the nexus between food security, climate change, and how we address the needs of the young people. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a 30-second anecdote to end, and before we thank the panel. I was reminded when I was working for Kofi Annan, it was International Literacy Day, and someone asked what's the Secretary General's favourite book? And this might be of interest to his family. And he said it's Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, which is a fictional account of the Buddha's life. And the Buddha, in the story, lives a life of riches as a prince, and he lives a life of great poverty, and he finally finds a middle way. And for me, my sense of what Kofi Annan was taking from that was how he mixed with people with real wealth and power, and saw the transformation that could come from allying that with meaning. And he saw the huge potential for people who are very materially poor but had a great potential, particularly women and girls. And I think his compassion and his humility saw that people from wherever walk of life we come from, wherever we end up, we have an amazing contribution we can make. I think that was his sense of inclusivity. So I want to end with a reminder. I think Kofi Annan's favourite word was amazing, and I think that this panel really was amazing. And I'd like to join me in appreciating our panelists.
Thank you.